The candles flickered atop the two identical cakes, 12 on each, their golden light dancing across the eager faces of the twins. Jacob and Tyler Matthews stood side by side at the head of the table, their matching blue party hats slightly askew, identically crooked grins stretched across their faces. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the large bay windows of the Matthews suburban home, casting a warm glow over the festivities. The living room was festooned with colorful streamers and balloons, the walls adorned with hand-drawn pictures from the twins' favorite cartoon series, Adventure Time. Sarah Matthews watched her boys with a serene smile, tucking a strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear. Her camera was poised, ready to capture the moment when her sons would blow out their candles and officially turn 12. Around the table stood grandparents, cousins, and a handful of the boys' closest friends, all joining in the chorus of Happy Birthday. Had any glanced toward the air vents in that moment, they might have noticed the subtle shift in the air current, the barely perceptible mist that began to seep into the room. But all eyes were fixed on the boys, all hearts full with the simple joy of celebration. "Sing happy birthday to the twins, everyone," Sarah called out, her voice melodious and light. Her husband, David, stood beside her, his arm draped lovingly around her waist, pride evident in his eyes. The gathered family and friends launched into an enthusiastic, if slightly off-key rendition of the birthday song. The twins exchanged mischievous glances, their identical hazel eyes sparkling with excitement. As the song reached its conclusion, Sarah stepped forward, the camera held high. "Make a wish, boys." The twins closed their eyes, their expressions suddenly serious with the weight of their wishes. They inhaled deeply, preparing to extinguish the flames with a single, powerful breath. Jacob opened his eyes first, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. His hand rose to his throat and he turned to his mother, a question forming on his lips that would never be voiced. "Mom." I feel Jacob's words cut off abruptly as he began to gasp, his small chest heaving with the sudden effort to draw breath. The room fell silent, the cheerful atmosphere evaporating like morning dew. Tyler, still unaware of his brother's distress, opened his eyes with a smile that quickly faded as he noticed the commotion. He turned toward his twin, concern etched across his features. But before he could reach out, his own breath caught, his eyes widening with sudden panic. "Jacob, Tyler," Sarah cried out, rushing forward as Jacob's knees buckled. She caught him before he hit the floor, lowering him gently. David lunged toward Tyler, who was now clutching at his throat, his face rapidly draining of color. "Call 911, David shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Grandpa Matthews fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed. Sarah crouched between her sons, one hand on each of their shoulders, her eyes darting frantically between them as they struggled for air. The twins' faces were turning an alarming shade of blue, their eyes wide with terror and confusion. "Help them! Someone help my babies!" Sarah pleaded, her voice rising to a desperate wail. David dropped to his knees beside Tyler, attempting to administer first aid while Sarah's father moved to help Jacob. The minutes that followed were a chaotic blur of shouted instructions, desperate pleas, and the twins' increasingly feeble gasps. When Sarah suddenly clutched her own chest and collapsed beside her sons, the room erupted into fresh panic. By the time the paramedics arrived, bursting through the front door with equipment and urgent efficiency, an eerie stillness had settled over the three figures lying on the floor. The birthday candles had burned down to puddles of wax, the flames extinguished by the draft from the open door. Later, neighbors would recall the jarring contrast of the ambulance's flashing lights against the festive balloons still visible through the Matthews windows. They would remember the sight of David Matthews crumpled on his front lawn, his face buried in his hands, as the paramedics emerged from the house, their expressions grim and defeated. No one noticed the maintenance van that pulled away from the curb several houses down, or the man inside who watched the scene unfold with cold, calculating eyes before driving slowly away. Chapter 2. 3 days before the birthday party, Sarah Matthews stood in her kitchen, coffee mug in hand, watching the early morning sunlight filter through the leaves of the maple tree in their backyard. The house was quiet, the twins still asleep upstairs, David already gone for his early shift at the hospital where he worked as a radiologist. She took a sip from her mug, savoring the moment of peace before the day began in earnest. On the counter beside her lay a to-do list for the upcoming party, her neat handwriting outlining tasks and timelines. The twins' 12th birthday was a milestone she intended to make special. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. Sarah glanced at the clock. 7:30 in the morning was an unusual time for visitors. Setting down her coffee, she made her way to the front door, peering through the peephole before opening it with a polite smile. A man in a blue uniform stood on her porch, clipboard in hand, the logo of the local HVAC company emblazoned on his breast pocket. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm from Comfort Air Systems. We've had reports of potential issues with the ventilation systems in this neighborhood, and we're conducting free inspections as a precaution. Would it be all right if I checked your system? It'll only take about 30 minutes. Sarah hesitated, her hand still on the door. "We didn't call for an inspection." The man nodded understandingly. "It's a preventative measure, ma'am. There have been several cases of carbon monoxide leaks in homes with similar systems to yours. The company is providing free inspections to all homes in the area as a community service. Better safe than sorry, especially with children in the house." His mention of children gave Sarah pause. How did he know they had children? But then again, the twins' bicycles were visible in the driveway, and their basketball hoop stood prominently in front of the garage. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "I suppose that would be fine." The air conditioning had been making an odd rattling noise lately, and David had mentioned getting it checked before summer arrived in full force. She stepped aside and let the technician in, leading him to the utility closet where the central air system was housed. As he set down his toolbox and began to examine the unit, Sarah returned to the kitchen to finish her coffee, keeping one ear attuned to the sounds of his work. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked as one of the twins got out of bed. Sarah glanced at her watch. It was earlier than their usual weekend rising time. Moments later, Jacob appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair tousled from sleep, eyes still heavy. "Mom, who's here?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Just an HVAC technician checking our air conditioning system," Sarah replied, moving to pour him a glass of orange juice. "Go on back to bed if you want, honey. It's still early." Jacob shrugged, accepting the juice. "I'm already up. Is Tyler awake?" "Not yet. You know how he is on weekends." Sarah smiled fondly. "Let him sleep a bit longer." The technician's voice called from the utility room. "Mrs. Matthews, could you come here for a moment?" Sarah excused herself and went to see what he needed. The man was crouched beside the air handler, a panel removed to expose the internal components. "I've found the source of that rattling noise you mentioned," he said, pointing to a loose fan belt. "I can fix that right now, but I'm also noticing some corrosion on these coils. It's not dangerous yet, but it could lead to poor air quality over time. I'd recommend a thorough cleaning and treatment." Sarah peered at where he was pointing, seeing nothing obviously wrong to her untrained eye, but nodding nonetheless. "How much would that cost?" The technician named a figure that seemed reasonable, explaining that since he was already there, he could do it immediately with no additional service call fee. After a brief phone consultation with David, who agreed it was better to address the issue now, Sarah gave the go-ahead for the additional service. The technician retrieved several canisters and tools from his van and set to work. From the kitchen doorway, Jacob watched with curious eyes as the man sprayed something into the vents and made adjustments to the system. The technician noticed his interest and smiled, offering a simplified explanation of how the air conditioning system worked. That left the boy nodding with newfound understanding. By the time Tyler finally trudged downstairs around 9, the technician was packing up his tools. The work was complete, he assured Sarah, and the system was now functioning optimally. He handed her an invoice, which she promptly paid, and a maintenance checklist that outlined what he had done. "All set, Mrs. Matthews. You shouldn't have any more issues, but here's my card if you notice anything unusual. The system might have a slightly different smell for a day or two as the cleaning solution dissipates, but that's perfectly normal." Sarah thanked him and showed him out. returning to find the twins engaged in their usual weekend bickering over who would get the last chocolate chip muffin. The matter of the air conditioning was quickly forgotten as she resumed her role as mediator, suggesting they split the contested muffin and reminding them about their plans for the day, a trip to the mall for new shoes, and, if they behaved, a stop at the arcade. Later that afternoon, as the family returned home with shopping bags and the twins' excited chatter about their high scores on the latest arcade games, David noticed a slight chemical smell in the house. "Did you clean with something new?" he asked Sarah as the twins raced upstairs to try on their new shoes again. Sarah explained about the HVAC technician's visit, showing David the invoice and maintenance checklist. He scanned it with his medical professional's eye for detail. "Seems legitimate," he said finally. "And if it prevents carbon monoxide problems, it's money well spent." Sarah nodded in agreement, though a slight unease lingered in the back of her mind, an intuition she couldn't quite place but ultimately dismissed as she turned her attention back to preparations for the twins' upcoming birthday celebration. That night, as the family sat down to dinner, none of them noticed the nearly imperceptible change in the air circulation, or the way the newly treated vents quietly distributed more than just cool air throughout their home. Chapter 3. The funeral was held on a Tuesday, 6 days after the birthday party that had transformed into a tragic tableau. The sky was a cruel, vibrant blue, the sort of perfect spring day that should have been spent on bicycles or at baseball games, activities the twins would never engage in again. The church was filled beyond capacity, mourners spilling out onto the steps, many of them parents from the twins' school clutching their own children's hands a little tighter than usual. 3 polished mahogany caskets stood at the front of the church, each adorned with flower arrangements, white lilies for Sarah and small bouquets of blue forget-me-nots for Jacob and Tyler. David Matthews sat in the front pew, his parents on either side of him, their aged hands gripping his arms as if to physically prevent him from collapsing under the weight of his grief. His face was ashen, eyes hollow, the events of the past week having carved deep lines around his mouth that hadn't been there before. The service was a blur of hymns and eulogies, words of comfort that felt empty against the vastness of the loss. Sarah's sister spoke through tears about Sarah's devotion to her family. The twins' baseball coach recalled their infectious enthusiasm and teamwork. David sat motionless throughout, his eyes fixed on the 3 caskets that contained his entire world. When it was his turn to speak, David rose on unsteady legs and made his way to the pulpit. The church fell silent. The collective breath held as this man, who had lost everything, faced the congregation. "My wife, Sarah," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, "loved traditions. Every year on the twins' birthday, she would hide small gifts throughout the house for them to find. Every Christmas Eve, she would read the night before Christmas, no matter how old the boys got." His voice cracked slightly, but he continued. "And every night, without fail, she would tell Jacob and Tyler that she loved them to the moon and back." He paused, drawing a deep breath. Jacob and Tyler were so different and yet so connected. Jacob, the analytical one who could spend hours building elaborate Lego structures. Tyler, the dreamer who filled notebooks with stories and drawings. Both of them kind, both of them bright, both of them gone before they could become the men they were meant to be. A sob escaped from somewhere in the congregation, but David continued, his gaze now fixed on the stained glass window above the altar, where sunlight streamed through in jeweled colors. "I always thought I understood loss. As a medical professional, I've had to deliver bad news to families. I've seen grief up close. But I never..." He paused, swallowing hard. "I never knew it could physically hurt to breathe, to exist in a world where they don't." After the service, the procession of cars wound its way to the cemetery, where 3 graves waited side by side. The caskets were carried by pallbearers, family members, friends, and for the twins, teammates from their baseball team. Boys their own age with solemn faces too young for such duty. As the caskets were lowered into the ground, David stepped forward to drop a white rose onto each one. Then, in a gesture that surprised the gathered mourners, he reached into his pocket and placed a small, folded piece of paper atop Sarah's casket before it was fully lowered. Detective Michael Chen, standing at the back of the funeral gathering, noticed the action with professional interest. He had been assigned to investigate the tragic deaths, which had initially been attributed to a severe allergic reaction, possibly to something in the birthday cake, but the preliminary autopsy reports had revealed something far more disturbing: traces of a rare toxin in all 3 victims' systems, suggesting deliberate poisoning rather than a tragic accident. As the funeral concluded and the mourners began to disperse, Chen approached David with the careful respect of someone who understood he was intruding on private grief. "Mr. Matthews, I'm very sorry for your loss," he said quietly, extending his hand. "I know this isn't the best time, but I was hoping we could talk briefly." David nodded numbly, shaking the detective's hand. His in-laws moved protectively closer, but he gestured for them to give him a moment. "You have questions about the investigation?" Chen confirmed, leading David a few steps away from the dispersing crowd. "We received the preliminary toxicology report this morning. I thought you should hear it from me directly." David's expression didn't change, as if he had no emotional capacity left for shock or surprise. "It wasn't an allergic reaction, was it?" he asked, his voice flat. "No, sir, it wasn't. The coroner found traces of a synthetic compound in their systems, something that causes rapid respiratory failure. It's not common, not something they would have encountered accidentally." David closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this information. "You're saying someone poisoned my family?" It was a statement, not a question. Chen nodded grimly. "We believe so. Yes. And given the specificity of the toxin and its delivery method, apparently through inhalation, this wasn't random. We're treating this as a targeted attack. A flash of something, anger perhaps, or simply pain, crossed David's face. "Do you have suspects?" Chen hesitated. "We're exploring several angles: your wife's recent activities, any conflicts at work, the boys' school." He trailed off, then added more gently, "And we'll need to look into your background as well, Mr. Matthews. Standard procedure." David nodded, his gaze drifting back to the 3 fresh graves. "Whatever you need, just find who did this." As they spoke, neither man noticed the solitary figure watching from a distance, partially concealed behind a large oak tree. The same man who had posed as an HVAC technician in the Matthews home. He observed the exchange between David and the detective with narrowed eyes, then turned and walked away, blending into the scattered groups of departing mourners. Back at the graveside, David's mother-in-law approached, her face streaked with tears. "David, the cars are waiting. We should go back to the house. People will be bringing food." He nodded absently, his mind still processing the detective's words. As he turned to leave, his gaze fell once more on the graves, and he found himself wondering what lay ahead in a life without the 3 people who had given it meaning. What he couldn't know was that the note he had placed in Sarah's casket, a private goodbye containing words of love only meant for her, would soon become a crucial piece of evidence in unraveling the mystery behind their deaths. 5 weeks before the birthday party, Dr. Eliza Harrington sat across from Sarah Matthews in her office at the Central Valley Medical Research Center. The spring sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the desk between them. Sarah fidgeted with her wedding ring, a nervous habit she'd developed over years of anxiety-inducing situations. "So, you're saying the results are conclusive?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Harrington nodded, her expression compassionate but professional. "The genetic markers are quite clear, Sarah. Both Jacob and Tyler carry the gene mutation. Given your family history and these results, there's a very high probability that they'll develop the same condition your brother had." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, memories of her brother Michael's slow deterioration flooding back. The gradual loss of motor function, the cognitive decline, and finally, the early death that had devastated their family 15 years ago. The thought of her vibrant, energetic sons facing the same fate was almost unbearable. "But you mentioned there's a new treatment protocol?" Sarah's voice found strength in hope. Dr. Harrington smiled, pushing a folder across the desk. Yes, and that's why I asked you to come in person rather than discussing this over the phone. Our research team has developed an experimental therapy that shows extraordinary promise in halting the progression of Kenner-Wallace syndrome before symptoms even appear. She opened the folder, revealing diagrams and charts. It's a gene therapy approach that essentially deactivates the faulty gene. The preliminary results from our animal studies are remarkable, and we've just received approval to begin human trials. And you think the boys could be a part of this trial? Sarah leaned forward, eyes scanning the technical information she couldn't fully comprehend but desperately wanted to believe in. They would be ideal candidates, Dr. Harrington confirmed. The therapy is most effective when administered before symptoms manifest, ideally in the preteen years. At 12, the twins are at the perfect age for intervention. Sarah's mind raced with questions. What are the risks? Side effects? Dr. Harrington's expression grew more serious. I won't sugarcoat this, Sarah. As with any experimental treatment, there are unknowns. The main concern is an immune response, essentially the body rejecting the therapy. In our primate studies, we saw this in about 20% of subjects. And what happens in those cases? The doctor hesitated briefly. In most cases, the reaction was mild and manageable. In 2 instances, it was more severe, requiring intensive intervention. She didn't elaborate further, but Sarah understood the unspoken implication. She pulled out a photograph from her purse, Jacob and Tyler at their last baseball game, arms slung around each other's shoulders, identical grins showcasing their recently acquired braces. Without the treatment, what are their odds? She asked quietly. Based on your family history and their genetic profile? Dr. Harrington met her gaze directly. They would likely begin showing symptoms in their late teens. By their mid-20s, the deterioration would be significant. Few patients with this particular mutation live past 30. Sarah stared at the twins' smiling faces in the photograph. The choice was agonizing yet clear. A risk now versus a certain tragedy later. I need to discuss this with my husband, she said finally. David should hear all this directly from you as well. Of course, Dr. Harrington agreed, checking her calendar. Could you both come in next Tuesday, 4 o'clock? Sarah nodded, gathering her purse and the folder of information. As she stood to leave, another thought occurred to her. Does the hospital administration know about this trial? About the twins' eligibility? Dr. Harrington looked mildly surprised by the question. Only the research committee and the ethics board. Patient confidentiality is strictly maintained. Why do you ask? Sarah shook her head dismissively. No reason, really. It's just David's been having some tension with the new hospital administrator, Dr. Mercer. Professional disagreements about the radiology department's protocols. I wouldn't want this personal matter getting tangled up in workplace politics. I understand, Dr. Harrington assured her. This stays between us, the research team, and whomever you choose to inform. As Sarah left the medical center, she didn't notice the man sitting in a parked car across the street, watching her exit the building. The same man who, weeks later, would enter her home in the guise of an HVAC technician. The man started his car and followed Sarah at a discreet distance, his expression impassive as he made a brief call on his cell phone. She knows, he said simply. Moving to phase 2. That evening, Sarah and David sat at their kitchen table after the twins had gone to bed, the folder from Dr. Harrington open between them. David had listened silently as Sarah recounted the doctor's explanation, his medical training allowing him to grasp the implications more quickly than she had. So this is what Michael had, he said finally, referring to Sarah's brother. And now, both boys. Sarah nodded, tears threatening. I always knew there was a chance, but with them being so healthy, so normal, I'd almost convinced myself they'd escaped it. David reached across the table to take her hand. This treatment, though, it could change everything. If it works, they might never have to go through what Michael did. And if it doesn't, Sarah voiced the fear they both harbored, if they're in the 20% that rejects it, David squeezed her hand. Then we'll face that together, like we've faced everything else. But Sarah, not trying means accepting a known outcome that we've both seen firsthand. At least this gives them a chance. Sarah nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. She hadn't told him about the nightmares that had plagued her since receiving the initial test results weeks ago. Dreams where she stood helpless as the twins slipped away from her, just as Michael had. I'll call Dr. Harrington tomorrow, she decided. Tell her we want to move forward with the screening process for the trial. Neither of them could have imagined that this decision, made out of love and hope for their children's future, had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to a very different kind of tragedy. One orchestrated by someone who had been listening to their conversation through a device planted earlier that day, when Sarah had absent-mindedly left her purse unattended in a cafe near the medical center. Chapter 5. 2 days after the funeral, Detective Chen sat in his cluttered office at the police station, staring at the evidence board he'd created for the Matthews case. Photos of Sarah and the twins smiled back at him. School pictures, casual snapshots from social media, and the stark contrast of crime scene photos that he kept in a separate folder, out of respect for the victims. The toxicology reports were conclusive. The cause of death was a synthetic neurotoxin called XR7, a compound developed initially for pest control but abandoned due to its extreme toxicity to mammals. It wasn't something available commercially. It would require specialized knowledge and access to produce. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Shen here," he answered. "Detective, this is Dr. Patel from the coroner's office. I've completed the full autopsy reports on the Matthews family, and there's something unusual I think you should see." "Can you summarize it for me?" Chen asked, already reaching for his jacket. "The toxin was delivered via aerosol, as we suspected," Dr. Patel explained. "But here's what's odd. The concentration was much higher in the air vents directly above where the twins were standing. The mother's exposure was secondary, likely when she rushed to help them. This wasn't random contamination, Detective. Someone calibrated this very precisely." Chen frowned, jotting notes. "That supports our theory of targeted murder. What about the cake? Any toxins there?" "None. Whatever they ingested was clean. This was airborne only." "Thanks, Dr. Patel. I'll be there in 20 minutes to pick up the full report." Chen hung up and surveyed the board again, his gaze settling on a photo of the Matthews home. The HVAC system. That had to be the delivery mechanism. He reached for the file containing David Matthews' initial statement, scanning until he found the relevant information. A service call from Comfort Air Systems 3 days before the party. A quick phone call confirmed what he already suspected. Comfort Air Systems had no record of sending a technician to the Matthews residence and had not been conducting any neighborhood inspections. Chen grabbed his keys, deciding it was time for another conversation with David Matthews. He found him at the family home, surrounded by boxes. The living room, which days earlier had been decorated for a birthday celebration, was now in the process of being packed up. David looked up as Chen entered, dark circles under his eyes, testament to sleepless nights. His parents had returned to their own home the previous day, leaving him alone with his grief and memories. "You found something," David stated rather than asked, recognizing the detective's purposeful demeanor. Chen nodded, taking a seat across from him. "We've confirmed the toxin and its delivery method through your air conditioning system. Whoever came to your house posing as an HVAC technician wasn't here to fix anything. He was here to set up a timed release of a very rare, very deadly compound." David closed his eyes briefly, processing this information. "So if Sarah hadn't let him in..." Chen nodded grimly. "That's the first piece. Now we need to figure out why. Who would want to harm your family, Dr. Matthews?" "No one," David insisted, his voice hollow. We were just an ordinary family. I'm a radiologist, for God's sake. Sarah was a part-time librarian. The boys were 12. Sometimes ordinary people get caught up in extraordinary circumstances," Chen observed. "I need to ask about your work. Any conflicts? Patients with grudges? Professional rivalries?" David shook his head dismissively. "Nothing serious. There was some tension with the new administrator over budget cuts, but that's hardly motive for murder. Chen made a note nonetheless. What about Sarah? Any issues in her life that seemed unusual? New acquaintances? Strange phone calls? David started to shake his head again, but paused, a flicker of recollection crossing his face. There was something about 6 weeks ago. Sarah seemed preoccupied, worried about something. When I asked, she said it was just stress about planning the twins' birthday, but he trailed off, trying to recall details. She was making more phone calls in private. She went to several appointments she was vague about. Medical appointments? Chen pressed. I assumed so, but she didn't say specifically. David ran a hand through his unkempt hair. I didn't push it. I thought if it was serious, she'd tell me when she was ready. Chen nodded, making another note. Was there anything else unusual in the weirdness for the party? Any changes in routine? Unexpected visitors? David thought for a moment, then shook his head. Not that I can remember. He paused, then added, except for the note. What note? Chen asked, his interest piqued. Sarah left me a note about 5 days before it happened. She said she'd put something important in our safe deposit box at the bank, and that if anything ever happened to her, I should check it. His voice cracked. I thought it was just her being cautious, maybe updating her will or something. I teased her about being morbid. Chen leaned forward. Did you check the box after? David nodded. Yesterday. There was an envelope with medical records inside, test results for the twins showing they carried a gene for some rare condition, Kenner-Wallace syndrome, and information about an experimental treatment trial at Central Valley Medical Research Center. He looked up, confusion evident in his reddened eyes. Does that mean something to you? Chen's expression remained neutral, but his mind was making connections. Did Sarah discuss these test results with anyone else? Friends, family, colleagues? I don't think so. She was very private about medical matters. After losing her brother to a genetic disease years ago, she was always worried about the boy's health. The detective made more notes, then asked casually, have you had any contact with Central Valley Medical since the funeral? Any doctors reaching out with condolences? Just routine expressions of sympathy from my colleagues. David's brow furrowed. Why? Chen stood, straightening his jacket. Just establishing a timeline. I'd like to take those medical records as evidence, if you don't mind. And I'll need the contact information for this research center. After leaving the Matthews home with the documents, Chen made a call to his partner, Detective Rivera. I need everything you can find on Central Valley Medical Research Center, he instructed. Specifically, anything related to clinical trials for Kenner-Wallace syndrome and any connection to a Dr. Harrington. While waiting for his partner's research, Chen drove to the medical center himself. The modern glass building housed several research departments, each with its own secure wing. At the reception desk, he flashed his badge and asked for Dr. Eliza Harrington. I'm sorry, the receptionist said after checking her computer. Dr. Harrington is no longer with our facility. Since when? Chen asked. She left quite suddenly about a week ago. Personal emergency, I believe. Chen's investigative instincts sharpened. That would be right after the Matthews tragedy. Was Dr. Harrington involved in research on Kenner-Wallace syndrome? The receptionist looked uncomfortable. I'm not authorized to discuss specific research projects. You need to speak with Dr. Mercer, our head administrator. Then I'd like to speak with Dr. Mercer, Chen stated firmly. After a brief wait, he was shown into an immaculate office where Dr. Victor Mercer, a thin man with steel gray hair and piercing blue eyes, greeted him with professional courtesy. How can I help the police department, detective? Mercer asked, gesturing for Chen to sit. Chen came directly to the point. I'm investigating the deaths of Sarah Matthews and her twin sons. I have reason to believe they were connected to a research trial here, specifically one involving treatment for Kenner-Wallace syndrome. Mercer's expression remained impassive, but Chen noticed his hands tense slightly on the desk. That's a very specific inquiry, detective. May I ask what led you to this conclusion? Chen placed the medical records on the desk. Sarah Matthews had these in a safe deposit box. They indicate her sons were candidates for an experimental trial run by Dr. Eliza Harrington, who, I'm told, left unexpectedly around the time of the Matthews deaths. Mercer examined the documents, his frown deepening. These appear to be authentic, but there's a problem, Detective. While we do conduct research on various genetic conditions, we have never had an approved trial for Kenner-Willis syndrome treatment. In fact, he added, removing his glasses, Dr. Harrington was terminated when we discovered she was conducting unauthorized testing using our facilities. Chen felt the case shifting beneath him like quicksand. Are you saying these records are fraudulent? Not fraudulent, perhaps, but definitely not part of any approved research protocol. Mercer's tone was measured. Dr. Harrington was brilliant, but increasingly unorthodox in her methods. When we discovered discrepancies in her research data and unauthorized use of laboratory resources, we had no choice but to dismiss her. When exactly was she terminated? Chen asked. Mercer consulted his computer. Officially, 3 weeks ago. But she had been on administrative leave for 2 weeks prior, while we conducted an internal investigation, which would align with the timeline Sarah had described to David, Chen realized. And do you have a current address for Dr. Harrington? Mercer shook his head. She cleared out her office and residence quite thoroughly. Our HR department has been unable to locate her for final paperwork. He hesitated, then added, Detective, there's something else you should know. Several experimental compounds went missing from our secure laboratory around the time of Dr. Harrington's departure. We've been conducting our own internal investigation. What kind of compounds? Chen asked, though he suspected the answer. Various research chemicals, including several neurotoxins, still in the experimental phase. One was a modified version of a compound called XR7. Chen felt a chill of certainty. That's the toxin that killed the Matthews family. Mercer's professional composure finally cracked, genuine shock registering on his face. My God, he whispered. What was Eliza thinking? I was hoping you might have some insight into that, Dr. Mercer. Did she have any connection to the Matthews family? Any reason to target them specifically? Mercer shook his head slowly. Not that I'm aware of. But, he paused, considering something. There was one project she was particularly secretive about. Research into genetic modifications that could potentially reverse certain inherited conditions. The ethics committee had declined to approve human trials due to significant safety concerns. She was quite bitter about that decision. As Chen left the medical center with a new direction for his investigation, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. The motive remained elusive. Why would a researcher target a family whose children might have benefited from her work, however unethical it might have been? The answer, he suspected, lay hidden in the past, in the connection between Sarah Matthews, her deceased brother, and a brilliant but potentially unstable doctor named Eliza Harrington. Chapter 6. One day before the funeral, in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, Dr. Eliza Harrington methodically packed equipment into a large traveling case. Her once immaculate lab coat was stained and wrinkled, her hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her movements were precise, efficient. The man who had posed as the HBAC technician watched from a chair in the corner, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. Was it necessary to eliminate the mother too? He asked, his tone casual, as if discussing a minor inconvenience rather than murder. Eliza didn't look up from her work. She was a complication we couldn't afford. Her intervention accelerated the compound's effect, that's all. The boys were the primary targets. The man, Marcus Reed, according to his fake identification, though that wasn't his real name, shrugged. Just seems messy, draws more attention. Eliza finally paused, fixing him with a cold stare. You were paid to do a job, not to critique my methods. The money's been transferred to your account as agreed. Our association is now concluded. Reed held her gaze for a moment before nodding and standing. He tucked the knife away and adjusted his jacket. "I'll be gone by morning. Might want to do the same, Doc. The police aren't complete idiots. They'll figure out it wasn't an accident sooner rather than later." After he left, Eliza returned to her packing with increased urgency. Among the scientific equipment, she placed a thick folder labeled Trial KWS-27. Inside were photographs and medical records of several children, including Jacob and Tyler Matthews. Their photos had been crossed out with red marker. Beneath these was an older photograph, a teenage boy in a hospital bed, a much younger Eliza sitting beside him, both smiling weakly at the camera. On the back was written, "Michael and Eliza, 2001. Eliza's phone rang, interrupting her reverie. The screen displayed a name that made her hesitate before answering. "Victor," she said flatly. "I assume the police have been to see you." Dr. Victor Mercer's voice was tightly controlled on the other end. "What have you done, Eliza? XR7. On children? Have you completely lost your mind?" She laughed, a hollow sound devoid of humor. "That's rich, coming from you. Did you tell the detective about your own role in all this? About how you shut down my research just when we were making breakthroughs?" "That research was dangerous and unethical," Mercer snapped. "The protocols weren't followed, the safety measures were insufficient. The ethics committee was right to reject it." "They were wrong," Eliza shouted, her composure finally cracking. "We could have saved those boys, we could have saved all of them. But you and your precious committee were too concerned with liability and regulations to see the potential." Mercer's voice softened slightly. "Eliza, listen to yourself. You poisoned innocent children. Whatever noble intentions you started with, you've become something monstrous. Turn yourself in. Get help." "It's too late for that," she replied, suddenly calm again. "But it's not too late for the others. My work continues, Victor. The Matthews twins were a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. Their genetic material has already provided the missing pieces we needed." There was a long silence before Mercer spoke again. "The police know about the missing compounds. They're connecting the dots. It won't be long before they find you." "Let them try," Eliza said, ending the call. She turned back to her packing, adding one final item, a small vial containing a clear liquid. Labels on similar vials in her case identified them as components of the experimental gene therapy she'd been developing for years, the treatment she believed could have saved Michael and later the Matthews twins. In her twisted logic, the twins' death served a purpose. Their genetic material, harvested during the bogus screening tests weeks earlier, had provided crucial data for perfecting her treatment. Their sacrifice, she believed, would ultimately save countless others with the same condition. What had begun as a promising medical career dedicated to curing the disease that took her brother had warped into a dangerous obsession, one that justified any action, no matter how horrific, in service of the ultimate goal. As she closed the case, a news alert appeared on her phone. A press conference scheduled for the following day, after the Matthews funeral. Detective Chen would be providing updates on the investigation. She still had time to complete her plan before disappearing, one final act that would either vindicate her work or condemn her forever. The morning of the funeral dawned with a pristine sky that seemed to mock the somber proceedings below. Detective Chen arrived early, watching from a discreet distance as mourners gathered. He'd stationed plainclothes officers around the perimeter, alert for any sign of Dr. Harrington, though he considered it unlikely she would risk appearing in public. His partner, Detective Rivera, approached with a tablet in hand. "Got something," she said quietly. "We've been running background on Harrington, looking for any personal connection to the Matthews family." Chen glanced at the tablet, which displayed an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Local teen succumbs to rare genetic disorder." Michael Lawson, age 17, died yesterday after a long battle with Kenner-Wallace syndrome, Rivera explained. Survived by his parents and younger sister, Sarah. Ah. Chen's eyes widened as he made the connection. Sarah Lawson. Sarah Matthews' maiden name was Lawson? Rivera nodded. "But here's where it gets interesting," she said, swiping to another article from a university newspaper dated 15 years earlier. It showed a photo of a research team, with a young Eliza Harrington prominently featured. The caption mentioned her work on genetic disorders, specifically Kenner-Wallace syndrome, inspired by her high school boyfriend's diagnosis. Chin studied the photo more closely. The boyfriend? Michael Lawson, Rivera confirmed. Eliza and Michael dated in high school. After he was diagnosed, she apparently dedicated her career to finding a cure. But she never did, at least not in time to save him. So Sarah Matthews was Michael Lawson's sister, Chen pieced together, and Harrington was his girlfriend who became a researcher to cure his disease. Looks that way, Rivera agreed. The timing fits too. According to the medical records David Matthews provided, Sarah only recently discovered her sons had the same genetic marker as her brother. She would have been looking for specialist treatments, leading her straight to her brother's former girlfriend, now a leading researcher in the field. But why kill the boys if she had spent her career trying to cure the disease? Chen wondered aloud. Rivera's expression was grim. Maybe we should ask her. She swiped to one final image, a security camera screenshot from early that morning, showing a woman matching Harrington's description, entering the funeral home where the Matthews family was laid to rest. Chen immediately radioed for backup but kept his voice low to avoid alarming the funeral attendees. All units, be advised. Person of interest may be on location. Proceed with caution. Likely armed and dangerous. As the funeral service began inside the church, Chen and Rivera positioned themselves strategically, scanning the faces of mourners. There was no sign of Harrington. It was only as the caskets were being lowered into the ground that Chen noticed David's unusual action, placing a folded note in Sarah's casket. The detective made a mental note to inquire about it later, still focused on locating Harrington. After the service, as mourners dispersed and David spoke with Chen, neither man noticed the slender figure in dark clothing who lingered near the graves after most had left. When the cemetery workers returned to complete their task, the figure was gone, but so was the note David had placed in his wife's casket. Back at the police station that evening, Chen arranged the evidence on his board, trying to construct a coherent narrative from the fragments they'd gathered. The connection between Harrington, Michael Lawson's family was clear, but the motive remained elusive. His phone rang, the lab calling with an urgent update. Detective, the technician said, "We've analyzed the trace evidence from the Matthews home ventilation system. The compound was designed to be temperature activated, specifically to aerosolize when exposed to heat. Like birthday candles," Chen realized with a chill. Exactly, but here's the strange part. The compound wasn't just a poison. It contained modified genetic material consistent with experimental gene therapy for Kenner-Wallace syndrome. It's as if someone was trying to treat the twins, not kill them. Chen finished the thought. But something went catastrophically wrong. He thanked the technician and immediately called David Matthews, who answered on the first ring. "Dr. Matthews," Chen began, "I need to know exactly what was in that note you placed in your wife's casket." David sounded confused. "Just a private goodbye." "Why?" "The exact words could be important," Chen pressed. "Please try to remember." There was a pause before David responded. "I wrote that I would keep my promise to her, that I would find the best treatment for the boys if the trial didn't work out, that I loved her to the moon and back. It was our saying." He hesitated, "And I apologize for not being more supportive when she first told me about the diagnosis, for suggesting we get a second opinion instead of immediately trusting her judgment." Chen processed this information. So Sarah was fully committed to this trial, even though it wasn't officially approved? She believed it was their best hope, David confirmed. After seeing what her brother went through, she was determined to spare the boys that fate. After ending the call, Chen stared at the evidence board, a new theory forming. What if Harrington's experiment hadn't been meant to kill the twins, but to save them? What if something had gone terribly wrong with an unauthorized treatment attempt? His phone rang again, this time an unknown number. Detective Chen, a female voice said when he answered. I believe you're looking for me. Dr. Harrington. Chen replied calmly, signaling to a nearby officer to begin tracing the call. Where are you? Somewhere you won't find me, she responded. But I'm calling because I want you to understand. What happened to the Matthews boys wasn't supposed to happen. The treatment should have worked. You administered an experimental gene therapy without authorization, Chen said, keeping his tone neutral to encourage her to continue talking. Through their ventilation system, timed to activate with the heat from birthday candles. It was elegant. Really, Harrington said, a note of pride in her voice. The therapy needed to be delivered as an aerosol, directly to the lungs. The timing mechanism ensured optimal dispersion. It should have worked, but it didn't, Chen stated flatly. It killed them, instead. There was a long pause. Something was contaminated, Harrington finally admitted. The viral vector must have mutated. I've reviewed the data repeatedly, and that's the only explanation. In all our previous trials, Chen interrupted. There were others? Harrington seemed to catch herself. That's not important now. What matters is that you understand this wasn't murder. It was science. An attempt to save those boys from a fate worse than death. Chen kept her talking, knowing the trace was still running. Tell me about Michael Lawson, he prompted. Her voice softened noticeably. Michael was brilliant, kind. He didn't deserve what happened to him. When he was diagnosed, I promised I would find a cure, even if it was too late for him. I would make sure no one else suffered as he did. Is that why you approached Sarah, because she was Michael's sister? She came to me, Harrington corrected. When the twins' tests came back positive, she researched extensively and found my work. She was desperate to save her sons from her brother's fate. I offered hope when the medical establishment offered none. Chen frowned. But the treatment wasn't approved. You were conducting unauthorized experiments. Bureaucracy and caution cost lives, Detective, Harrington snapped. The ethics committee, Mercer, all of them, they hide behind procedures while children die. I refused to wait for permission slips while I had a viable treatment. So, what went wrong? Chen asked. There was a long silence before Harrington replied, her voice suddenly sounding very tired. I had to rush the final formulation. When Mercer suspended me, I knew it was only a matter of time before I lost access to the lab. I had to move quickly, finalize the treatment before you were fired, Chen finished. So you cut corners. I made a calculation, she corrected. The risk of waiting seemed greater than the risk of proceeding. I was wrong. Her voice cracked slightly. I never intended for Sarah to be affected. She wasn't supposed to be close enough to inhale a lethal dose. Where are you now, Dr. Harrington? Chen asked again, having received a signal that they'd narrowed the trace to a cell tower near the airport. Somewhere I can continue my work, she replied, composure regained. Those boys didn't die in vain, Detective. Their genetic material has provided crucial data. The next version of the treatment will work. I'll make sure of it. There won't be a next version, Chen said firmly. Turn yourself in. Help us understand exactly what happened. Harrington laughed softly. It's too late for that. But there's one thing you should know. She paused. The note David Matthews placed in Sarah's casket, I have it, and it confirms what I've told you. Sarah knew the risks. She consented to the treatment, even knowing it was experimental. She was desperate to save her sons, just as I was desperate to save Michael all those years ago. In her place, wouldn't you have done the same? Before Chen could respond, the line went dead. Moments later, his phone pinged with a message containing a photo of the note David had written to Sarah, along with another note, in different handwriting, presumably from Sarah to David, mentioning her decision to proceed with Dr. H's treatment, regardless of the official approval status. Chen stared at the image, realizing how the lines between victim and perpetrator had blurred in this case. Sarah Matthews, in her desperate love for her children, had become an unwitting accomplice in their deaths. agreeing to an unauthorized experimental treatment that ultimately killed them. Yet Eliza Harrington, driven by her own complex mix of scientific ambition and lingering grief for Michael, had crossed ethical and legal boundaries with devastating consequences. The next morning, international authorities alerted Chen that a woman matching Harrington's description had boarded a flight to Argentina, a country with limited extradition agreements with the United States. By the time they confirmed her identity, she had already vanished again. 1 week later, David Matthews sat alone in his empty house, surrounded by packed boxes. The home where he had built a life with Sarah, where they had raised their boys, now echoed with absence. He held a framed photograph of the 4 of them from the previous summer, a camping trip where the twins had caught their first fish, Sarah had burned the marshmallows, and they had laughed until their sides hurt. The doorbell rang, startling him from his reverie. Detective Chen stood on the porch, a manila envelope in hand. "I thought you should have these," Chen said when David invited him in. "They're copies of everything we found, the full story, as much as we can piece together." David accepted the envelope but didn't open it. "Did you find her?" "Harrington." Chen shook his head. "Not yet, but we will. International agencies are on alert. She can't hide forever." He hesitated before adding, "There's something else you should know. We believe Sarah agreed to the experimental treatment, knowing the risks, understanding it wasn't officially approved. She was trying to save the boys from the disease that took her brother." David nodded slowly. "That sounds like Sarah. Once she made up her mind about something, especially when it came to protecting the twins." He trailed off, unable to continue. "It doesn't make what Harrington did any less criminal," Chen added firmly, "but I thought you should know that Sarah's actions came from love." "I know that," David said quietly. "Everything she ever did was out of love." After Chen left, David sat with the unopened envelope for a long time. Finally, he placed it in a box with other important papers, medical records, birth certificates, school reports, evidence of the life his family had lived. Tomorrow he would drive across the country to start a new job at a different hospital, in a city where no one knew his story. He would carry the truth with him always, the knowledge that his family had been destroyed, not by malice, but by the collision of love, desperation, scientific ambition, and tragic miscalculation. Outside his window, the sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Somewhere in that same sky, Sarah had once promised the twins, was Michael, watching over them. Now all 3 had joined him, leaving David alone with questions that would never have satisfactory answers and grief that would never fully heal. In his pocket, he carried the twins' matching keychains, small brass compasses they had received for their 11th birthday. Sarah had told them that no matter how lost they felt, they could always find their way home. David wondered if he would ever find his way back from this devastating loss, or if he was destined to wander, unmoored, for the rest of his days. In Argentina, Dr. Eliza Harrington set up a new laboratory under a different name, continuing her research with an even greater sense of urgency. The failure with the Matthews twins had been a setback, but in her mind, merely a step in the scientific process. Her monitors displayed genetic sequences, some from the twins, some from other children with the same condition, as she worked tirelessly toward the breakthrough she still believed was possible. On her desk sat a small framed photo of Michael Lawson, faded with age but carefully preserved. Next to it, she had placed a newspaper clipping about the tragic deaths of Jacob and Tyler Matthews, a reminder of the cost of her ambition and the debt she owed to those who had unwittingly sacrificed for her cause. In her darkest moments, doubt crept in, questions about whether her pursuit of a cure had twisted into something Michael would have condemned. But by morning, those doubts were always pushed aside, buried beneath the conviction that had driven her for 15 years. That no other child should suffer as Michael had, whatever the cost. And so the cycle continued. A tragic illustration of how love, whether Sarah's for her sons or Eliza's for Michael, could become something destructive when mixed with fear, desperation, and the arrogance of believing one knew better than everyone else. Back in the small American town still reeling from the tragedy, parents held their children closer, checked their ventilation systems, and looked at birthday candles with newfound wariness, never knowing that the real danger had not been some extra, but the complex and flawed humanity within us all, capable of both tremendous love and terrible misjudgment.